Hey guys, tonight we're going to dim the lights, settle into that one spot on the mattress that feels just right, and let the frantic, noisy hum of the modern world simply evaporate. We're going to take a very long, very slow, and arguably very pungent walk through one of the most embarrassing civic disasters in the history of the British Empire. We're talking about a time when the most powerful city on earth was brought to its knees not by an invading army or a political coup, but by its own bathrooms. This is the story of the Great Stink of 1858, a moment when London became so physically offensive that the government literally couldn't breathe. So, get comfortable, adjust your blankets, and let's float back to a sweltering July in Victorian London, where the River Thames was less of a waterway and more of a giant, slow-moving vat of industrial-strength sludge. Now, to understand why London decided to spend the summer of 1858 gagging into its silk handkerchiefs, we have to look at the state of Victorian plumbing. In the mid-19th century, London was growing at a pace that its infrastructure simply couldn't handle. It was the heart of the world, the center of commerce and progress, but underneath all that top-hatted dignity was a very messy reality. For centuries, Londoners had used cesspools, basically giant brick-lined holes in the ground under their houses, to deal with, well, you know. But then came the invention of the water closet. Now, the flush toilet was supposed to be a miracle of modern hygiene. It was clean, it was elegant, and it was a status symbol. The problem was that everyone's new, fancy toilets were all connected to the old, crumbling sewer pipes that were originally only designed to carry away rainwater. And where did all those pipes lead? Straight into the Thames. Every single flush from every grand townhouse and every cramped tenement was being delivered directly into the city's main water source. Because why bother with a complex waste management system when you have a perfectly good river right in the middle of town? It's the kind of short-term thinking that really makes you appreciate your modern utility bill. By 1858, the Thames had reached its breaking point. It wasn't just human waste anymore. It was runoff from the slaughterhouses, chemicals from the tanneries, and the general refuse of 3 million people. The river had become a thick, opaque soup of various shades of brown and gray. People still drank from it, of course, because the concept of germs was still a bit of a fringe theory at the time. They called it tasting the river, which is a phrase that should probably be banned from the English language for all eternity. Then came the heat wave. July 1858 was abnormally hot. The sun beat down on the low, sluggish waters of the Thames, and the river began to ferment. It wasn't just a bad smell, it was a physical force. It was described as a miasma so thick you could almost lean against it. It was a smell that traveled through walls, through closed windows, and through the very soul of the city. The most unfortunate group in this whole situation was the British Parliament. You see, the Palace of Westminster, that grand Gothic masterpiece where the laws of the empire were made, is built right on the banks of the Thames. For years, the politicians had ignored the engineers and the doctors who warned them that the river was a ticking bomb. They figured they were safe in their high-ceilinged rooms. But in the summer of 1858, the river finally lobbied back. The smell inside the House of Commons became so intense that members were seen fleeing the chambers with their noses buried in scented bouquets. They tried to soak the curtains in chloride of lime to neutralize the odor, but it just created a chemical cloud that smelled like bleach mixed with, well, a centuries-old cesspool. It was a scent combination that no amount of Victorian stoicism could survive. Benjamin Disraeli, the future prime minister, once stood up to give a speech, took one whiff of the air coming off the river, and promptly sat back down. Even the law of the land had to yield to the law of the nostrils. They considered moving the entire government to Oxford or St. Albans. They talked about building a massive wall. But eventually, the politicians realized that they were literally being smelled out of their own jobs. The Great Stink had done what decades of scientific reports couldn't. It forced the government to actually do something about the sewers. They called in Joseph Bazalgette. Now, Bazalgette was an engineer with a plan that was as massive as the problem. He wanted to build 82 miles of main intercepting sewers and 1,100 miles of street sewers. It was a project that would require 318 million bricks and more concrete than anyone had ever seen. He wanted to intercept the waste before it hit the river and carry it far to the east, past the city limits. The most interesting thing about Bazalgette was his foresight. When he was calculating the size of the pipes needed for London's population, he doubled it. He said, "We're only going to do this once, so we might as well do it right." Because of that one decision, London's sewer system is still working today, long after the Victorian era has faded into history books. He was a man who understood that while kings and queens are important, a good drainage system is what actually keeps a civilization upright. As the new sewers were built, the smells slowly began to lift. The river began to clear. The Great Stink became a memory, a cautionary tale about what happens when you ignore the basic plumbing of life in favor of grander things. As we leave the damp brick tunnels of Bazalgette's London and the ghosts of the gagging politicians, just feel the fresh, cool air of the room around you. The river is flowing. The pipes are clear. The summer of 1858 has finally cooled down. So, while Joseph Bazalgette was busy digging through the London mud to save the city from its own waste, there was another man who was much more interested in the surface, the glitter, the velvet, and the gold. We're floating away from the brick sewers of the 1850s now and drifting a few decades back to the early 19th century. We're going to meet George IV, the Prince Regent, a man who essentially treated the British Empire like his own personal credit card with a limit that simply didn't exist. George was the son of George III, the Mad King we'll visit shortly, but the prince was a different kind of disaster. He wasn't losing his mind, he was just losing his sense of proportion. He was the First Gentleman of Europe, a title he gave himself, which is usually a sign that you are, in fact, the most difficult person in the room. He was charming, he was witty, and he was possessed by a shopping addiction that would make a modern influencer weep. George's biggest project was the Royal Pavilion in Brighton. Now, Brighton at the time was a sleepy seaside town where people went to dip their toes in the cold salt water. George decided it needed a palace. But he didn't want a normal palace. He wanted something that looked like a fever dream of the Orient. He hired the architect John Nash to transform a modest farmhouse into a sprawling Indo-Saracenic fantasy, complete with onion domes, minarets, and enough gold leaf to gild a small moon. Inside, it was even weirder. There were cast iron palm trees, dragons hanging from the chandeliers, and a dining room that sat 80 people under a ceiling painted to look like a tropical sky. It looks like a giant stone wedding cake that had accidentally landed on the English coast. And the cost? It was staggering. George spent hundreds of thousands of pounds on the pavilion while the Napoleonic Wars were raging, and the poor of London were eating the very things we discussed in The Great Stink. Because why worry about the national debt when you really, really need a chandelier shaped like a lotus flower? George's personal life was just as cluttered as his architecture. He was legally married to Caroline of Brunswick, a woman he famously detested from the moment he saw her. When they first met, he reportedly turned to a servant and said, "I am not well, get me a glass of brandy." Not exactly the romantic spark the history books look for. He spent the rest of his life trying to divorce her while simultaneously maintaining a secret, illegal marriage to Maria Fitzherbert and a revolving door of mistresses. As George aged, his lifestyle caught up with him. He became so incredibly large that he had to be hoisted onto his horse with a crane. He wore corsets so tight that he reportedly fainted during public ceremonies because he couldn't actually breathe. He lived in a haze of laudanum and cherry brandy, hiding away in the pavilion or at Windsor, terrified that the public would see how much he had changed from the handsome prince of his youth. The irony of George was that while he was a personal and financial catastrophe, he was also a magnificent patron of the arts. He gave us the Regency style, he helped build Regent Street and Regent's Park, and he filled the royal collection with some of its greatest treasures. He was a man of exquisite taste and zero self-control. When he finally died in 1930, the public didn't mourn. They mostly just felt a sense of relief that the bills would finally stop coming. The Times wrote an obituary so scathing, it's a wonder the paper didn't catch fire, noting that there never was an individual less regretted by his fellow creatures than this deceased king. As we leave the flickering candles of the Brighton Pavilion and the scent of expensive perfume and brandy, just feel the quiet weight of the night. The party is over, the prince has been carried to his rest, the dragons on the chandeliers are still. So the Prince Regent has finally been lowered into his oversized vault, leaving behind a trail of unpaid tailors and a palace that looks like a daydream of India. It's a bit of a relief for the national treasury, surely, but to understand how George IV became such a runaway train of excess, we have to look at the man he spent his life trying to avoid and eventually trying to replace. We're floating back a bit further now, into the quiet, increasingly strained hallways of Kew Palace to meet King George III. Now, George III gets a bit of a bad rap in the history books, especially the American ones. He's usually portrayed as the mad king who lost the colonies, a sort of shouting, wig-wearing villain. But the reality is much more human, much more tragic, and, true to our style, considerably weirder. George was actually a very decent man. He was Farmer George, a king who loved agriculture, clockmaking, and his wife, Queen Charlotte. They had 15 children together, which is a lot of names to remember, even if you aren't having a mental breakdown. But in 1788, the king's brain simply glitched. It started with a persistent cough and a bit of insomnia, but it quickly spiraled into a state of total delirium. George began to talk and talk and talk. He once reportedly spoke for 24 hours straight without stopping for food or sleep, his voice becoming a raspy, unintelligible whisper as he discussed every subject from the price of grain to the genealogy of the German nobility. He was a man whose thoughts were moving faster than his mouth could keep up with. This is where we get into the sleepless historian territory of royal medical care. The doctors of the late 18th century didn't have much in the way of psychiatry. Their solution to a king losing his mind was essentially to torture him back into sanity. They used blistering, applying caustic chemicals to his skin to create painful sores, believing this would draw the bad humors out of his head. They put him in a straight waistcoat and strapped him to a chair for hours. It was a brutal, terrifying experience for a man who was already confused and frightened. But the most famous symptom, the one that really keeps medical historians up at night, was the color of his urine. It was reported to be deep purple or even blue. Modern science suggests that George might have suffered from porphyria, a rare genetic blood disorder that can cause abdominal pain, sensitivity to light, and, you guessed it, vividly colored waste and temporary insanity. However, recent research suggests it might have just been a severe form of bipolar disorder, exacerbated by the heavy doses of arsenic in his medicine. Either way, the King of England was literally being poisoned by his own doctors and his own biology. There's a famous story, perhaps a bit exaggerated but fitting for the vibe, that George once got out of his carriage at Windsor and walked up to an oak tree. He reportedly gripped a branch, shook it, and began a long, formal diplomatic conversation with the tree, believing it was the King of Prussia. He was polite, he was articulate, and he was completely, utterly gone. He would have lucid intervals where he was perfectly fine, followed by months of darkness. In 1810, after the death of his favorite daughter, Princess Amelia, he slipped away for the final time. For the last 10 years of his life, King George III lived in a suite of rooms at Windsor Castle, a ghost in a purple dressing gown. He was blind, he was deaf, and he had grown a long white beard that made him look like a character out of a fairy tale. He spent his days playing the harpsichord and talking to people who had been dead for decades. While he was wandering the corridors of his mind, his son, the Prince Regent we just met, was busy spending all the money on dragons and domes. The Mad King was kept out of sight and out of mind, a quiet tragedy tucked away behind the velvet curtains of Windsor. When he finally died in 2020, he had been king for 60 years, though he had barely been there for the last 10. He was a man who had seen the world change, the empires rise and fall, all while he was arguing with trees and listening to music only he could hear. As we leave the silent, dusty rooms of Windsor and the echoes of the king's harpsichord, just feel the quiet weight of the fog. The talk has finally stopped. The king is at peace. The harpsichord is closed. So, we've watched King George III drift away into a world where oak trees are diplomats, and his own mind is a labyrinth of purple shadows. It's a quiet, lonely sort of tragedy, isn't it? But as we float away from the foggy gardens of Windsor, we're heading further east, into a landscape where the winters are much longer and the stakes are much higher. We're going to the Alexandra Palace in Russia, where another royal family was trying to keep a secret that was arguably more dangerous than any political revolution. We're going to meet the Romanovs and the strange, bedraggled man who became their only hope. To understand the Romanovs at the turn of the 20th century, you have to realize that they were living in a bubble of almost impossible luxury. While the rest of Russia was beginning to boil with industrial unrest and hunger, Tsar Nicholas II and his wife, Alexandra, were retreating into a private world of religious mysticism and domestic bliss. They had 4 daughters, the beautiful, spirited Otsma sisters, but what the Russian Empire desperately needed was a boy, an heir. When Alexei was finally born in 1904, the bells of St. Petersburg rang for days. But the joy was short-lived. Alexandra, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, had brought with her the royal disease, hemophilia. For little Alexei, the sunbeam of the family, a simple tumble or bruised knee wasn't just a childhood injury, it was a crisis. His blood didn't clot. A small internal bleed could turn into a week of agonizing pain, his joints swelling until he screamed for death to take him. Because the Tsar and Tsarina were terrified of looking weak, they kept the illness a state secret. This meant that the Russian people saw a prince who was often carried by a giant sailor and a Tsarina who looked increasingly haggard and neurotic, but they didn't know why. And in that vacuum of information, a shadow began to grow. That shadow had a name, Grigory Rasputin. Now, Rasputin wasn't a doctor. He was a starets, a wandering holy man from Siberia who smelled of unwashed wool and cheap wine. But he had a gift. In 1907, when Alexei was suffering from a particularly terrible bleed that the best doctors in Europe couldn't stop, Rasputin was called to the palace. He sat by the boy's bed, whispered some prayers, and told him stories of the Siberian wilderness, and miraculously, the bleeding stopped. To Alexandra, this wasn't just luck, it was a sign from God. She became convinced that as long as the friend was near her son, the boy, and by extension the entire Russian Empire, would be safe. Rasputin became the most powerful man in Russia, not because he was a genius, but because he was the only one who could stop a mother's heart from breaking. The irony was that while Rasputin was saving the heir in private, his reputation was destroying the dynasty in public. He was a notorious lecher and a heavy drinker, and rumors of his influence over the German woman, as the public called the Tsarina, turned the Russian people against the throne. To the starving workers of St. Petersburg, it looked like the country was being run by a crazy peasant and a superstitious queen. As the world moved toward the catastrophe of World War I, the Romanovs stayed in their bubble. They lived in a world of incense, icons, and Rasputin's prophecies, while the real world was being torn apart by machine guns and barbed wire. Even when Rasputin was eventually murdered by a group of desperate nobles in 1916, an assassination that involved poison, bullets, and an icy river, the damage was already done. When the revolution finally arrived in 1917, the Romanovs were almost surprised. They were moved from palace to palace, their world shrinking until it was just a few rooms in a house in Siberia. They spent their final days as a family, the sisters sewing jewels into their corsets for safekeeping, and the boy, Alexei, still struggling to walk, still waiting for the friend who was never coming back. As we leave the cold, quiet cellar of the Ipatiev house and the ghosts of a lost empire, just feel the stillness of the Russian night. The jewels are hidden. The prayers have gone unanswered. The sunbeam has finally set. So, the Romanovs have faded into the Siberian mist, leaving behind a world that has no more room for absolute tsars or holy men from the wilderness. It's a chilling thought, how quickly a 300-year dynasty can be reduced to the silence of a snowy basement. But as we float away from the ruins of the Russian Empire, we're heading south and west into the deep, dark heart of the Bavarian Alps. We're going to meet a man who saw the world becoming cold, industrial, and practical, and decided to build his own reality out of stone, music, and moonlight. We're going to meet Ludwig II of Bavaria, the Swan King. Now, Ludwig was born into the House of Wittelsbach in 1845, and from the start, he was a bit of an outlier. He was impossibly handsome, tall, and dreamy, but he had the misfortune of being a romantic poet trapped in the body of a 19th century monarch. He hated the business of being a king. He hated the ministers. He hated the parades. And he particularly hated the fact that his kingdom was slowly being swallowed up by the growing power of Prussia. Ludwig's solution was simple. If he couldn't be a powerful king in the real world, he would be a legendary king in a world of his own making. He became obsessed with the operas of Richard Wagner, those grand, loud, mythical tales of knights, swans, and ancient German gods. He spent a fortune patronizing Wagner, effectively funding the composer's lifestyle while his own government looked on in horror. To Ludwig, Wagner's music was the only thing that made the prosaic world bearable. But his true passion was architecture. Ludwig began to build. He didn't build useful things like bridges or hospitals. He built fairy tale castles. His most famous, Neuschwanstein, was perched on a jagged cliff overlooking the Polat Gorge. It was a dizzying, theatrical tribute to the Middle Ages, filled with frescoes of Lohengrin and Tannhauser. It had a throne room that looked like a Byzantine church, but no throne, because by the time it was finished, Ludwig had no power left to sit on one. Because why bother with a parliament when you can have a private grotto with an artificial lake and a wave machine? As Ludwig grew older, he withdrew further and further from reality. He became a creature of the night, sleeping all day and traveling through the mountains in an elaborate gilded sleigh at night, the bells jingling through the silent, snowy forests. He would hold solitary performances at the Munich Court Theater, where an entire opera would be performed just for him, sitting alone in the dark, because he couldn't stand the sight of other people. He became increasingly eccentric, talking to the statues in his gardens and holding dinner parties for imaginary guests like Louis XIV and Marie Antoinette. He was a man living in a museum of his own mind, while his debts mounted to millions of marks. His ministers, desperate to stop the spending, finally decided that the only way to save Bavaria was to get rid of its king. In 1886, a medical commission declared Ludwig insane without ever actually examining him. They cornered him at Neuschwanstein, stripped him of his power, and took him to Berg Castle on the shores of Lake Starnberg. The very next day, Ludwig and his psychiatrist went for a walk along the lake. They never came back. Their bodies were found in the shallow water that night. To this day, nobody knows if it was a murder, a suicide, or a desperate escape gone wrong. The irony, the classic sleepless historian twist, is that the insane castles that nearly bankrupted Bavaria are now the state's greatest source of income. Millions of people travel from all over the world to see the dream that Ludwig died for. The man who hated the public is now the reason the public visits his home. As we leave the dark, still waters of Lake Starnberg and the silent white towers of Neuschwanstein, just feel the cool mountain air on your face. The music has faded. The sleigh bells have stopped. The king of dreams is finally at rest. The night is long. The mountains are silent. The dream is preserved in stone. Everything is quiet. Subscribe if you love this kind of immersive historical storytelling. It's not just facts, it's feelings. Drop your current city and time in the comments. I love knowing who's sailing the night seas with me.